All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into the role of, knowledge experts and how they kind of shape how we see the world. And for that, I think there's no better starting point than Max Weber and his very influential work, Science as a Vocation. We're going to be pulling out the big ideas, the core arguments from that today.
Yeah, and in this deep dive, we're really aiming to get a grasp on Weber's thinking about, what science is at its core, what drives the people who make it their life's work, and then the always tricky relationship between science and things like politics, personal values, that kind of stuff. And of course, where responsibility comes in for anyone who's, dealing with ideas, knowledge, professionally, or even just as a citizen, right?
And you know what always strikes me about Weber is that this isn't just some historical artifact. This is stuff that hits you right now in how we all deal with information overload, figuring out who to trust, what to believe. It's really potent. So to kick us off, maybe one of the most clear-cut places Weber starts is this idea of keeping politics out of the classroom.
Oh, absolutely. He was adamant about that. Like the lecture hall, the university, that's not the place for pushing your own political agenda. And his reasoning, it boils down to the teacher's role, right? It's about being intellectually honest, giving students the tools, the knowledge, the methods of science, not trying to turn them into, mini-me's for your political views. It's like the classroom's for thinking, not converting.
Right, and he was worried about that, right? That when a teacher uses their position to push their own politics, it creates a really unbalanced power dynamic.
Totally. I mean, Weber saw the lecture hall as a place where students are, in a way, intellectually vulnerable. So if the teacher's using it as their own platform, their own soapbox, it's not just, their ego getting in the way. It means the students might feel pressured to agree, to not challenge things, even when they should. And that harms their ability to think independently.
So it's like the focus needs to be on giving them the ability to think for themselves, even if they end up disagreeing with the teacher.
Exactly. That's at the heart of it.
Yeah.
Weber was all about the teacher's obligation being to the student's intellectual growth. So that means showing the whole picture, the methods, the different arguments, even when it goes against what the teacher personally believes. It's about creating thinkers, not, disciples.
He's very clear in separating that from, someone who's a public speaker, a politician, someone trying to rally people to a cause. There's a different purpose there.
Yeah, and it's interesting how he puts it, right? You've got the scholar who's all about this careful analysis, trying to be objective. And then you've got the prophet, the fiery speaker who's trying to get people to do something, to act on a belief. They're in totally different spheres, The academic is bound by evidence, by logic, even when it's unpopular, while the public figure is driven by passion, conviction.
So, for anyone listening, think about where you get your information from. Is it a classroom? Is it the news? Is it social media? What's the point of that space? And how does, a political slant or the lack of it change how you take in what you're reading, what you're hearing? Now, moving on, I think we got to get into this idea of science as a vocation. What did Weber think were the core things someone needs intellectually to be in that world?
Well, he was pretty clear that it takes a certain kind of mind, a certain dedication. It's got to be someone who's drawn to rational understanding, who's good at breaking down complex ideas, making the concepts really precise. It's not for the faint of heart intellectually.
Yeah.
You need to be able to handle a lot of information, see the patterns, the logic in it all.
And this is crucial. He's also saying that science has its limits, right? It can tell us the how, but not the why, if that makes sense. It can explain the mechanics of the world, but not what gives it meaning, what matters most.
Absolutely. And this is where it gets really interesting. Weber argues that while science can inform our choices by showing us, the most effective ways to get something done or what the consequences might be, it can't tell us what we should be aiming for in the first place. What we value, what's important to us, that's a whole other realm. It's beyond scientific proof. Science can tell you how to build a bomb, but it can't tell you whether using it is right or wrong.
Yeah, and that leads to maybe one of his most stark statements, right, about how we can't scientifically prove our values. He says the devil and not God determines our standpoint. That's pretty heavy stuff.
It is, and I think what he's getting at is how deep our fundamental beliefs go.
Yeah.
Science is about logic, evidence, but our values, those often come from somewhere more foundational, something we can't really dissect under a microscope, so to speak.
So for our listeners, think about the times you've made decisions based on information. What role did hard facts play? And what role did your own gut feeling, your sense of what's right, play? Could science on its own have told you what to do? Now, I think we got to zoom out a bit. What about the impact of science on society, on politics, on, the big picture?
Well, Weber saw science as this incredibly powerful force, especially in driving technology and what he called the control of life through calculation. It gives us the tools to manipulate our world, even ourselves, in ways that were unthinkable before.
But, and here he is again with the limits. Just because we can do something scientifically doesn't mean science can tell us if it's the right thing to do, morally, ethically. It can't answer those big questions about how we should live, how society should be structured.
And that's where things can get tricky, right? Because this progress can come with a downside. Weber talked about the disenchantment of the world, meaning, as science explains more and more, we rely less on, say, magic, religion, for answers. And while that can make things more predictable, more rational, it can also leave people feeling like empty, like something's missing in terms of meaning, purpose.
And that's when, as he puts it, people start looking for new idols, new things to fill that void. Could be nationalism, could be humanitarianism, even just being totally devoted to your career. But his point is, those are still beliefs. You can't scientifically prove one is better than the other.
And this is where the responsibility of scientists, of experts, really comes into play. Weber felt very strongly that they need to be super aware of these limits and not try to pass off their own opinions as scientific fact just because they have authority.
Especially he was worried about teachers, right? People who might even subtly push their own worldview onto students, making it seem like it's, objective truth.
Exactly. To him, that was like the opposite of what intellectual honesty should be. A teacher's there to show the different sides, to help students think critically, not to, brainwash them into believing only one way of seeing things.
So you listening out there, when you're taking in information, especially from people who are presented as experts, take a second to think. What are their beliefs, their values? How might that be coloring what they're saying? Are they being clear about what's a fact and what's their own take on it? This all leads to, the big question that Weber himself asks once he's laid all this out.
Right. After all those caveats, he goes, if this is so, what then does science actually and positively contribute to practical and personal life? It's like, okay, if it can't tell us the meaning of life, what good is it really?
And what's his answer? What does he say science does bring to the table?
He says it's crucial in a few ways. One, it's the basis of technology, of our ability to actually shape the world around us. Two, it teaches us how to think logically, precisely, which is useful no matter what you do. And three, even if it can't tell us what to choose, it can show us the likely outcomes of our choices, which is still valuable.
And he also talks about science's ability to make us face the meaning of our own actions, right? By showing us the facts, the potential consequences, it forces us to examine our values, the choices we're making, in a really stark way.
Totally. And here, the teacher's role is vital. A good teacher, for Weber, is someone who helps students deal with what he calls inconvenient facts, those pieces of evidence, those conclusions that maybe challenge what they believe, what they want to be true.
Even if those facts go against the teacher's own views, right?
Oh, absolutely. For Weber, that intellectual honesty, putting the truth and the student's learning above your own bias, that's the highest standard. A teacher shouldn't be trying to force their own, he uses the word Weltanschauung, it's like their whole worldview onto the student.
So to wrap it up, what would you say is the big responsibility of a teacher, according to Weber? What are they supposed to do for their students?
I think at its core, it's about showing them the choices, the consequences of those choices, and the underlying meaning or maybe lack of meaning from a purely scientific perspective of those choices. It's about giving them the tools to think for themselves, to decide what matters to them.
And think about it, everyone listening. Have you ever had that moment where you had to face an inconvenient fact? Something that challenged what you thought you knew in your personal life, at work, wherever? How did that change your perspective, your decisions? That's what Weber's really getting at.
So to sum up, Weber is all about that separation. Science over here, with its objectivity, its rigor, and politics values over there. He sees science as this demanding but important calling, but one that's got to be honest about what it can't do. Provide ultimate meaning, tell us what to believe.
And it's amazing how relevant this is, right? We're drowning in information, people claiming scientific backing for all sorts of things, trying to sway us politically, socially.
Exactly. And what Weber gives us is a way to see through that, to be more critical, to think about the values behind the information, the difference between objective truth and someone's opinion.
So here's a final thought for everyone. In a world where science gets used to justify so much, how can we individually get better at seeing that line between what's actual knowledge and what's someone's belief? What's your role in all this and navigating this crazy information landscape we're in? Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.